We'd like to welcome Dr. Bradley Fisher with us this morning. He's, wow, come on up here. Give us your message.
Well, good morning. Thank you for the invitation to come here this morning and share some ideas with you. I cannot tell you how glad I am to be here finally, because I'm so tired of revising this presentation. I was supposed to speak to you in March. I was invited to come on March 19th. And I declined because I had a senior art exhibition that I was organizing, and I thought that it would just make me too crazy since I was already stressed enough. It actually turned out fortuitous that I turned it down because I was diagnosed with COVID on March 18th. So I would not have been able to be here. So it's good to be here finally, and I chose to pick up on the theme that you were discussing in March on vulnerability. The theme of this presentation is vulnerability. One definition of vulnerability is feeling at risk of being harmed, whether real or imagined. The harm can be physical, emotional, psychological, material, political, spiritual, and so on. Anything we care about makes us vulnerable. At the root of vulnerability is fear. When we're afraid, we have a fight or flight response. We can run from the vulnerability or stand fast and confront it. It is a lifelong condition that we can accept and use for growth, or we can hide from it and create defenses against it. Again, even as I'm listening to the opening for this gathering, I'm quickly taking notes as things are popping up on the screen, recognizing vulnerability as we negotiate challenges. Boy, that's at the heart of what I plan to say today. If a person is defensive, they're closed off and guarded. I would argue that this makes growing much more difficult. At the very least, vulnerability creates nervousness since we're confronted with circumstances where the outcome is uncertain, where we're not in control. Will we be hurt? And if so, how bad? And for how long? Just by a show of hands, for those of you in the sanctuary, and I suppose those that are tuning in by Zoom can raise your hands too, but I won't see them. How many of you felt vulnerable during the peak of the COVID epidemic? Yeah. I mean, think about that historical event. Global vulnerability. We haven't experienced something like that since the early 1900s. Global vulnerability. Everyone was vulnerable. No one was exempt from the risk. I tried to conceptualize during the COVID epidemic, and I actually kept track of numbers nationally. And at the peak of the epidemic, 20 people were dying, roughly, if you want to use it state-wise, 20 people per state every day, 1,000 a day, sometimes much more than that. And yet there were people who would walk around, even though they could control things, at least their vulnerability by wearing a mask and distancing. There were people who still refused to wear a mask because they said it intruded upon their sense of control. Which mystified me, because people will gamble on a lottery ticket where the odds are far less of winning than of contracting COVID and of dying from COVID. Global vulnerability. So let's use a couple of other examples. How many of you feel vulnerable when speaking in front of a group of people? When my wife and I were members of this church and my wife would have to make an announcement, she would bribe me with desserts if I would get up and make the announcement for her. Sorry, Kathy, I revealed that, but how many of you feel vulnerable going in for a medical procedure? Take your pick. Or walking or driving in unfamiliar locations at night. Or being in a group setting where you want to be accepted. Going for therapy. Being asked about your political or religious views by people you don't know. Being yelled at or called a name. And the list goes on. The point here is that we all feel vulnerable more often than we actually acknowledge. Consider driving. When we're driving a car, we're vulnerable. We may be safe drivers, but I think we all recognize in Springfield there's a lot of crazy drivers out there. So, for example, what does it mean when you see a green light? Go. Red light? Yellow light? Yeah, too many responses to get that, but it actually means slow down and approach with caution. But some people think it means speed up to get through the intersection. The point here is that our sense of security hinges on the belief that others are playing by the same rules. And that's just about driving. You can apply this to relationships as well. Now, I wanted to share a few examples from my own life to show you where I was vulnerable. And the first comes from when I was 5 years old and in kindergarten. It was my first day of kindergarten. I'd brought my sack lunch with me to school, and I was sitting on a bench waiting for the teacher to call us into class with my sack lunch right next to me, and a big boy came over and sat down on my lunch. Then he got up and looked at me and started laughing. What that taught me is that school was not necessarily a safe place from bullies. Here's another story that illustrates occupational vulnerability. Anyone who chooses to work with at-risk populations automatically, if they have a heart, make themselves vulnerable. As a gerontologist, I chose to work with older adults. And I became very attached to a woman named Marion. She was 93. And I need to tell you just a couple quick stories about her so you'll understand why I became so attached to her. She lived in a multi-level care facility, and so people would gather down in the meal area for their congregate meal, and she would sit with a few of the other residents. And often at these tables, they would talk about their heart problems, or the pain in their leg, or their gallbladder. And Marion dubbed these organ recitals. She was the first person I ever heard use that phrase for that. Now, Marion, ironically, suffered from a lot of ailments. She had congestive heart failure. She was legally blind. She had gastrointestinal problems, and she was confined to a wheelchair. But she didn't complain. But as she's walking through this facility, people would say, "How are you?" And Marion hated superficial talk. Now, she knew what people wanted her to say. "Fine, how are you?" They weren't really interested in her telling them how she really was. So one night in her room, she got out a long piece of paper and drew a crude diagram of her body, and then drew arrows to every part of her body where she had an ailment. And she rolled this up, and going around in her wheelchair, the next person asked, "How are you?" She took this scroll and unscrolled it and said, "Here, have a look for yourself." People stopped asking her, which was the whole point. So I became very attached to Marion, as did the activity director, Lori. And I had visited Marion. She had some problems, wound up in the hospital, and I'd visited her a couple days before, and I got a call in the afternoon, and Lori said, "Bradley, you have to come to the hospital. We think we're losing Marion." And so I rushed to the hospital, and as I got onto Marion's floor, there was Lori standing outside of Marion's room. And I walked toward her, and she rushed toward me and fell into my arms sobbing, saying, "She's gone, she's gone. It hurts so much, Bradley, it hurts so much. And I let her cry for a little bit. And then after a moment, I gently took her by both shoulders and moved her to arm's distance. And I looked at her and I said, Lori, if I could take away your pain right now, all of your pain, but you'd have to forget Marion, lose all your memories of Marion, would you make that trade? She said, no, absolutely not. I've learned so much from Marion. I couldn't do that. And I nodded and I said, yes, that's the price we pay for what we do. The last is an example that I dealt with just a year ago I call legacy vulnerability. I have a granddaughter who's now 5.5. At the time, she was 4.5, which was a significant age for me because I met with my brother and I said to Gary, my grandfather Julius died when I was 1.5 years. My brother's 3 years older than I am. And I said, Gary, what do you remember of Julius? Tell me. And he said, I don't. I have vague images, but no memories really of nothing I can call forward. And it broke my heart because I thought about my granddaughter who's 4.5, and if I died, what would she remember of me? What would she carry forward? What might she pull on when she was 20 or 30 or 50? Would there be any living memories of me at all? That's legacy vulnerability. We're vulnerable to others, at least those whose opinions we care about. However, when someone is brave enough to be honest and point out our shortcomings, how do we respond? Hey, thanks for telling me. I'm going to use that input to become a better person. No. Our first response is usually defensive and making excuses. Along with the input of others, we're vulnerable to the critic who lives inside our own heads. We can be our own worst enemy. But vulnerability is often misunderstood as inaccurately equated with weakness. Intimacy, by its very nature, requires us to be vulnerable, to reveal and acknowledge both strengths and weaknesses. Can we have a genuine, evolving relationship without being vulnerable? I don't think so. We have to let our guard down, be vulnerable so another can truly know us, to understand and be understood. How can we grow in or outside a relationship if we're not willing to be open? Now imagine someone who thinks he or she is perfect. There's no motivation to change. The person who always thinks he or she is right fights against feeling vulnerable by denying inconvenient facts or blaming others, external justification. No blame on me. If we're not open to the possibility of flaws, we have no motivation to fix what we see is not broken. We push away any chance for meaningful growth. Now I'm going to push my time limit just a little bit and tell you another story that I decided to add this very morning. It is not a flattering story about me. I've done this before in class and used myself as my own worst example. But it is relevant, and it happened just a couple days ago. My wife and I were at 10th Theater, and everybody was struggling to get to their seat. And we were at the very end of a row, needing to get by people to get into the middle of the seats. And we walked in a couple seats, and there were 4 women standing there. They'd found their seats, and they were just standing there talking, and clearly we could not get through. And one woman turned to me and said, I thought rather sharply, "Are you going by?" Now, the compassionate and nice response would be, "Yes, please." Instead, she used a sharp tone with me, or I thought she did. Do you hear that? The external justification there? And what I said was, "I'm trying." She straightened up and let us go by. And my wife and I got to our seats, and as Kathy sat down, she said, "What did you say to that woman?" My wife. She doesn't let me get away with anything. And I said, "What?" Innocently. "Why? What do you mean?" No blame on me. "Well, when I went by, I heard her turn to another woman and whisper, 'So rude.'" Well, there are two things to take from that. The first is I was embarrassed because I don't want to be seen as a rude person. I don't really want to be rude to other people. But I made a choice in that moment when she said sharply, I want to stress sharply, impatiently, I made a choice. Didn't matter how she sounded. Didn't matter if she was the nastiest person in the world. I made a choice to respond the way I did. The second thing, now keep in mind that reflecting is never an easy thing to do when it's on oneself. It's often uncomfortable, as this was for me. But I also had to acknowledge the fact that my wife, who was following in my wake and who overheard this comment, was victimized by my rudeness, because she listened to that woman say, "So rude." And I could just imagine her say, "I don't want to be associated with that man who's the rude man. I'm not with that rude man. I'm just following him and sitting next to him." So we do have a choice in every moment, and I'll return to that idea in a moment. In terms of vulnerability in aging, which is the title of this presentation, I want to stress that we're vulnerable through all stages of our lives. It's not something that rears its head when we hit 65 or whatever age you want to designate when old age begins. We're vulnerable as children and need to be protected. We're vulnerable as young adults as we seek to become independent. And we're vulnerable throughout adulthood as we look for love and meaning. Again, we are vulnerable through all stages of our lives. It doesn't begin and it doesn't end. But it does raise an interesting question. Are we more or less vulnerable as we age? Well, yes and no. Certainly as we age, we're more aware of potential harm, all the things that can go wrong. Recall when you were a small child. Are you worried about the bills to be paid? Are you worried about illness, unless you're ill, or death? Your legacy? No. As children, we are free of many of those worries. But as we age, we become much more aware of the many things that can happen, where we're vulnerable, and this means worries also increase. It's no coincidence that antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications are bestsellers in this country. You may have seen advertised now, they now have antidepressant enhancers. I like to think of them as antidepressants for your antidepressants. However, as we age, we also develop coping strategies, ways to handle uncertainty and adversity. The value of such strategies depend on whether they facilitate or hinder growth. There are events in later life which will challenge us and make us vulnerable, and we can see this just by looking at the event of retirement. Retirement usually means we have less power in the workforce, which may be accompanied by lessened income and increased financial vulnerability. It also means that our professional identity becomes less and less important to others as a retiree. You're no longer a professor, you used to be a professor, or whatever you used to be. We will certainly confront the feeling of being less needed unless we seek out new ways to find purpose and meaning. We'll also be vulnerable in terms of finding a satisfying daily routine. If you think about your work lives, everything gets structured around your work lives. And all of a sudden, when you're not working, you have to figure out what you're going to do with your life. Retirement challenges our identity as productive citizens, but the broader label of old challenges us in many ways. There's a broader societal view of older adults, which admittedly has become better in the last 4 decades, but still contains some insidious stereotypes. A couple of years ago, within the last couple of years, there was a movie that came out where there were people stranded on a remote island. And these people were being terrorized. And we were supposed to be terribly scared by this movie. What happened to these people on this island is every night they would age a certain number of years. And the terrifying, gut-gripping title of this movie was Old. What does that communicate to you? Old. I'm scared. And you were supposed to be. And it was designed not for an older audience, but for a younger audience. I had an experience with a neighbor. I had to move my mailbox because another neighbor was being weird, and so I moved the mailbox to the only place that I could move it. And the neighbor on the other side was pissed off because I essentially took away his favorite parking spot. And I said, you only need to leave it open from 10 to 4 when the mailman comes by. Well, but we can't park there. He could park there 18 other hours of the day, but not those 6 hours. Well, and he was really upset. And so I went over to make peace, and I was trying to explain to him how this all happened. And his response to me was, I don't need to hear your old man talk. Well, I'm glad you responded that way. I did too. I just shut up and I looked at him and just turned around and walked away. But I realized why this example has stuck with me for so long. It was the first time I had ever been confronted by hostile ageism. People have teased me about my age. One of my friends who's like 11 years younger likes to call me the old man. He's moving there too. But it was the first time someone with hostility had used my age as something against me. Are we dismissed or are we listened to? A friend, Clyde, I knew in Michigan at 82 said, I have a lot to offer younger people, but would they listen? He thought not. His declaration has haunted me all throughout my years as a gerontologist. One thing is guaranteed. We will confront physical changes which will limit our capabilities in certain areas, and in the event of serious decrements, are likely to result in significant changes in our lifestyle. We work hard throughout our lives to gain and maintain independence, which is another way of saying to gain control over our daily lives. No one gives independence up lightly, and not usually without a struggle. Many of you have probably had the talk when you were adult children with older parents. When do you take away the keys? Our cars are one of our last vestiges of independence, and those keys are generally not given up easily. Relationships may also change, largely due to physical declines, and we may confront a role reversal where adult children are now telling us how to live our lives. I have a friend, Olga, at 94, who is experiencing some serious memory and physical declines, and have had some intense conversations with her son, with whom she's living. And he's now talking about having to find to place her somewhere. It's a very difficult decision, but her presence in his household, the caregiving, is not only becoming excessively burdensome, but is changing his lives, the quality of his life, in a way that he does not want. His granddaughter phrased it far less compassionately and said, we need to put her away, like a worn-out pair of shoes. All of these changes can cause identity issues, where we're confronted by circumstances and have to come to terms with what this means for how we see ourselves and how we're seen by others. I believe that the latter part of life can teach us to open up to vulnerability. Rather than resist it through defensiveness, we can try to recognize it as an opportunity to learn more about ourselves and even to educate others who will also be old one day. That is, if they're lucky enough to live long enough. It comes to mind is Mitch Albom in the book he wrote, Tuesdays with Morrie. And Mitch would visit Morrie on Tuesdays, and Morrie was dying. He had people who had to do everything for him, bathing, toileting, everything. And Morrie used his decline as an opportunity to teach Mitch Albom about dependency, but also wanted Mitch to look beyond the dependency and see all the love that was beneath the care that others were providing for him. He was a teacher until the day he died. Olga, when I was visiting her, again, just Friday, Olga, who was telling me about her loss of memory because she's aware, says, "Don't get old." And I looked at Olga, I said, "Olga, I'm 68, I'm already defined as old. What is the option? You want me to die young or younger? Oh, don't get old." But what she was really saying is don't get ill and dependent. Accepting vulnerability involves letting go, which certainly starts in retirement, if not before, letting go of preconceptions of how things should be, letting go of our defensive barriers, letting go of our need to control. Being vulnerable means being open to suffering, to pain. The hymn today, I didn't plan that, but one of the lines, "Though with pain I made my way. Though with pain I made my way." Now, I don't want to suggest that dealing with pain and suffering is easy. It isn't. And maybe one of the hardest things we do. But this is the only way toward lasting growth. Suffering is the foundation of growth and wisdom. We're born vulnerable, and we grow through adversity and vulnerability. Growing is not without struggle. No one grows without suffering. Aeschylus said, "He who learns must suffer." Aristotle declared, "Learning is not child's play. We cannot learn without pain." And yet, enduring that suffering is not easy. If it was easy, we would all be gurus and saints. Growing ourselves is the most important task we take on in life, along with the relationships we form and how we contribute to the growth of others. Being vulnerable is a lifelong condition, as long as we remain open to change and open to learning. But we tend to hold stubbornly on to the illusion of control. Control is one way to combat fear. We can control what we do and think, but we cannot control the behavior or perceptions of others. What is always in our control is our attitude and how we respond to life circumstances. Being responsible, being response-able. And this finally brings us to what I refer to as the 4 A's for positive aging. Attitude. Attitude involves how we see the world and consequently how we interact with it. This is something we control moment to moment. I would return to the 10th theater example and my attitude at that moment. Not good. Does the day hold promise, or is the day ahead full of dread? Second is activity. Do we seek meaningful engagement or couch potatohood? Finding purpose versus filling time. Third is adjustment or adaptability. The only constant in life is change. And since things change, we have to be able to recognize we have to be able to reorganize priorities and expectations. We have to be able to adapt and adjust. And fourth is acceptance. We will confront change and loss, but it's up to us what we do with it. We can deny changes, but this does not help us to realistically understand the situation. Acceptance is recognizing what is, and that allows us to move forward. Gurdjieff said, and I quote, "You are in prison. If you think you are free, you can't escape," end quote. When it comes to harm, we need to protect ourselves where we can. Good locks on doors, careful financial planning, taking care of our health, nourishing relationships, finding balance in the choppiness of life. But there are inevitable changes and losses, vulnerability to suffering. And for this, I turn to Rabbi David Wolpe and his book, Making Loss Matter. Quote, "Life is not an intellectual puzzle. Life is a precious, one-time chance to grow. We grow not by solving riddles, but by creating meaning. Change is the passing away of one state and the coming into being of another. Loss is one of the faces of change. Without loss, we would live in a steady state world, a world where progress is stilled. The blessing we seek in life is not to live without pain, it is to live so our pain has meaning. Loss is arbitrary. Our valor in living and our determination to make sense of life is wisdom," end quote. The only thing I can control, moment to moment, is my attitude and how I respond to what life brings my way. I'll do what I must to protect myself and those I care about. However, in my relationships, I choose vulnerability based on trust that I will not be indiscriminately hurt, that others will respect the openness for what it is. I choose to be vulnerable and open to new ideas because I want to grow and hope to be surrounded by others with the same passion for self-understanding and enlightenment. I say yes to vulnerability, and I say yes to love. Thank you.